their master. Social licence is a real issue, and I'm interested from the perspective, particularly of the industry, whether they feel as though they have an understanding of how the dynamics of social licence works in a full enough way to make it meet the needs of the community as well, and industry is clearly a part of that. So it's not a very specific question, but it is the emerging question, which I think is the elephant in the room. How does social licence work?
I think it's partly related to this gentleman's question before about to what extent are people listening to those who have concerns on the ground about development of the resources that we've been talking about. Both of you might want to respond to that question.
I mean, it's hugely important, and I think that it's certainly from a mining industry point of view, the scale of mining has increased greatly in this country in a very short period of time, given the commodity cycle that we're in. So if you take somewhere like New South Wales, where mining in the Hunter Valley, for example, is taking place on top of, next to and underneath multiple alternative land uses, relatively large established populations, and in a very short period of time, in a matter of a couple of years, the notion that mining was something that happened on the fringes actually disappeared, because it was very, very much part of the daily existence of people, and the impacts of mining, whether that was the 2,000 contractors that drive through town, or all of those kinds of impacts that have happened rapidly and have been a great shock to many communities. And has been hugely difficult for the mining industry to deal with that in ways that address all of those concerns. So I think, firstly, we were not well geared up for the impacts of the scale and the rapid nature of the increase in the industry. I think that our industry has made an enormous effort over the last couple of years to try to redress that. Certainly the kinds of community dialogue initiatives that we've had, which is about communities setting the agenda rather than the industry saying, you think this is the problem and this is what we're going to do about it. So we've tried to reverse that, which is around a shift in power, or the perception about who's the powerful party. And I think that that's an important thing, and that will be ongoing. And I'm never saying it's a journey, because corporations are full of people who have all sorts of concerns, environmental concerns, social concerns. Miners live in the communities where they mine. They're not divorced from what's happening around them. So it is, I think it's the industry's sort of number one domestic issue to actually make sure that we are adequately listening and responding to the things that people actually really need us to respond to, and that government is, both state and Commonwealth and local in some cases, that government is actually working with communities. We, for example, in my previous role, had identified with 6 local councils in the Hunter Valley their top 5 infrastructure needs, which were things that people there absolutely needed. Our royalties, we wanted a proportion of those royalties to address these desperate needs. So we were hand in hand with the community talking to government. We couldn't get government to come to the party on that. So I think that there has to be a change in the way all parties are interacting, and I think the industry has started that and taken the steps. It's not far enough. But government is way behind still, in my view.
Well, I'll just add to that. I mean, I think we would say for our industry, whether it be the offshore part of the industry or for onshore now with coal seam gas, the issues are not below the ground, the issues are above the ground. They are those social licence to operate issues. It's probably the biggest thing that we talk about and think about in terms of how we can ensure that we are able to bring communities along with us, ensure that there is a supply of factual information out there for people, and also can engage as successfully as we can in making sure that we do respond to people's concerns. But it's a very difficult thing to do because, as you said, for each of the components of our energy sources, there is a huge amount of emotion attached to them. And but it is, I can assure you, about the number one thing that we talk about as to how we can actually do a better job here. And we're not saying that we've done this perfectly, but it is a very, very important part of what we do and what we think about.
Question. Oh, sorry, did you want to add, Michael?
On concerns in the community with coal seam gas, wastewater, that's something which I wonder about. So if you're a local in such an area, how is that going to be dealt with, and the heavy metals and other things that's in that stuff, in a responsible way?
The water issues, I mean, there's many ways of dealing with that. I mean, in Queensland, for example, if I just take Queensland because that's where the industry is at its most advanced, primarily it's re-injected. It's re-injected. There are other places in Queensland particularly where you're using that water, you purify the water, and then you use that on farms as a source of water for some of those farms. Water is the big issue. There's no doubt about that, and that's a very emotional issue for farmers, and we're very much alive to that fact. And the biggest issue has been, I think, all of the projects get done on a sort of project-by-project basis, but the concerns of the farmers have been well, what's the cumulative effect of the use of water? And there's been, in Queensland again, a massive study done by the Queensland Water Commission, which has verified some of the estimates which the industry itself had to the amount of water usage. And they're, in the overall scheme of things, they're relatively small, but that's not to say that they are very, very serious issues, particularly for individual farmers. So water is, the number one issue that we try to deal with, and make sure that there is a good understanding from the individual farmer as to what's actually going to happen with any water which is, comes out of the process.
One question here, I think.
Thank you. My name is Gordon Alderson. I live in Geelong. And if anybody's here from Shell, you might recognise me. I've been known as an environmental activist in terms of improving the emissions coming out of the Shell Geelong refinery. Matthew, you won't clap when I finish my question.
Should I?
We'll start booing. Professor Brear, in your framing, you made a statement, I think it was your fourth one, it was the fourth one that I wrote down anyway, which was, to me, amazing, which was the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is not controversial. This file I have is one that I presented at a previous audience similar to this at Melbourne University around about 6 weeks ago. And when I did, I produced it as a file of evidence of the corruption of climate science. Please, just hold. Just be respectful. And this file of evidence was presented to Mr. Greg Hunt on the 27th of April 2011. And as a result of my question, which I aimed at Mark Dreyfus when he was here last, I have actually moved to the point where he and his office are considering whether they will also review this file of evidence of the corruption of climate science.
So you asked,
now,
is there a question for Mike?
Here's my question.
I'm not a climate scientist.
Here's my question. My question is this, and it's for the two representatives, one from the Gas Association and the Coal Association. Will those two industries review their due diligence in terms of the corruption of climate science?
Would you like to?
Well, what's the exact phrase of the IPCC report? Highly likely that it's occurring. I don't know, if I went to my doctor and my doctor said I was ill, I might seek a second or third opinion, but after 1,000 opinions, I'd tend to believe them, even though I'm not a medical doctor. That's my personal view on it, as a non-specialist, and we all take the advice of specialists.
Can you
I'd agree with that. In terms of our industry's position, it's exactly the same, and climate change is real. I think the scientific debate is around the magnitude of the change, and so is it going to be 6 degrees, is it going to be 2 degrees, etc., and the policy settings that you would attach to that different magnitude. And that's where the debate is. That's where you'll get conflict. That's a normal part of scientific discovery.
Well, yeah, I'd say the same thing. I think it's a question of rate of change and magnitude, and there's many uncertainties associated with that. But I think as an industry, we don't take a view particularly on the science, other than the fact that we accept the risk that there is, that greenhouse gas emissions from anthropogenic sources are leading to the risk of climate change, and so we've been taking actions accordingly, or at least member companies have been taking actions accordingly. And it's also reflective of what's happening within the law in Australia as well, and we comply with the law.
Yeah. Thank you.
So did you have another?
Just a quick thank you for your responses. I take it from both of your responses that you really aren't all that sure about the science.
We're not scientists,
I think
but we're not going to look at the file, I think.
I think the only other comment one could make really is that there is obviously a lot of people who would have a view that would be similar to yours, but I suspect if we had the files of the people who support climate science, the room would be full of paper against the one file. So
You must understand that I'm a graduate of this university in Professor Brear's faculty.
right.
And a colleague of mine who's not a graduate of this university, but another university, he and I both got engaged and all that stuff. I was a believer in climate science. I actually took Shell and included an item in their EIP saying that they ought to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. One of 153 items we put into their environmental improvement plan that they accepted. I have come to the view that I was wrong.
Okay. Like that's a good view, and I applaud you for it. And can I please ask you if you might, happy to have a conversation later, but we might give someone else the opportunity to make a point or ask a question if that's okay. And there was one over here, I think. It might have to be almost the last question, I think.
G'day, it's Mark Dess, just a personal view rather than any affiliated view. I think there's been a lot of reference to the IEA work tonight. I just asked perhaps the speakers if they could make some comment upon their use of the scenarios. I think the audience could be left with the perception that those IEA scenarios that were cited were almost recommendations as to what the future might look like, whereas in fact, particularly with respect to the new policy scenario, my recollection, I don't have it in front of me, so I could be misquoting slightly, but my recollection of the new policy scenario was saying just how far short of where we would need to be to keep climate at a safe level was. I can't remember the figures, but the new policy scenario was falling so far short that it was multiples of an increase in temperature associated with that new policy scenario. And similarly with the gas scenario, I mean, the IEA my understanding was basically saying a hell of a lot more needed to be done than any of those scenarios. I wonder if you'd like to comment particularly and also clarify your understanding of scenarios in that context.
Yeah, my memory is that the new policy scenarios, the worst case was a 6% rise in temperatures. So in other words, the 6 degrees, 6%, sorry, 6 degrees, yes. So that was obviously, the tracking was very grim. So even where all countries with their current commitments to reduce emissions, whatever they are, and the technologies and everything else, we were still going to be 3.5 or something like that percent. I've done it again, degrees. So clearly they're salutary, it makes for a salutary read, because if we are going to meet the IPCC's recommended rates, additional work needs to be done. And talking about the kind of complexities around CCS, those complexities apply to other technologies too. So we don't have a tremendous amount of time to sit on our hands and think about it. There actually does need to be very concerted international action on the technology front around all of our energy sources to actually deal with that, because the world is not going to stop consuming energy.
Yeah, look, I think the IEA I think that new policy scenario is consistent with the 3.5 degrees centigrade